Okay, we're ready to begin the lesson today, and the topic is a continuation of what Cynthia was talking about last week. She was talking about Romans 13, and Romans 13 says you need to obey the authorities that are in charge of you. God has placed them into power and authority, and if you don't obey them, then you are breaking God's rules. And it doesn't lay out any exceptions for that. It seems like you always have to obey the authorities. And Cynthia's point was, no, that's not true. There are times when you don't obey the authorities. And so we're going to continue on from that and say, or ask the question, when does it end? When is it necessary to disobey the authorities? And how do we make that decision? And of course, it's biblically based, and we'll be going into all the depths of that. So, click. Okay, you aren't seeing the screen I thought you'd be seeing. Anyway, we're living and learning. Okay, so we live in amazing times, and it seems to get more amazing every day. Every week I seem to see some more crazier thing than I've ever seen before happen, and it's kind of shocking. And so this picture here is a Canadian pastor. He's been arrested multiple times for COVID stuff because in Canada they were actually shutting down the churches and making rules for churches on what they could and couldn't do, and he felt that wasn't right. And so we'll look also at the basis for ignoring authority, and we'll look at him and whether he's doing the right thing. But what we do notice in all of this is that society is starting to exclude the church and starting to make no representation or no allowances for the church, and kind of expecting that they have control over the church, and that becomes a real problem for that. And so even in countries who have a constitutional or something equivalent to constitutional right to worship, they're stepping on that right and starting to control churches or trying to. And so that really brings us to the question for this lesson, and that is, when does Romans 13 come to an end? When does it become necessary to make that decision that I'm not going to obey what the authorities have told me to do? So the roadmap for this lesson, I like this roadmap idea, so I'm probably going to keep on with it. And so it gives you kind of an outline of what we're going to do here. So we're going to start with the idea that we're in a special time, and in a time where we haven't seen in this country, where churches are, the government is trying to control churches in ways. And we've seen that beginning like 20 years ago. We even saw some hints of it. 10 years ago, we saw some specific things that were tried but failed. And so, but now we're actually seeing governments making a sincere effort to do that. And we even see some documents coming out of government authorities about doing more things to limit the church and what the church can teach. And so that really becomes a problem. So we're going to look at that idea first and what's going on in society a little bit. And we're also going to look at how it is that evil people come into authority. And that's going to be important to understanding some of the background for making that decision when you can or when you do and don't obey an authority. And so the next question we'll look at after that is, when evil people get into authority and they start to step on God's turf, they start to tell the church what to do, or Christians what to do and how they should live. And that becomes a problem there. And we'll spend a bit of time on that idea, what the Bible says about that. And then we'll look at some examples from the Bible, mostly from the Bible, about people, godly people who ignored evil laws that were on them. And we'll get some important lessons from the Babylonian captivity period of Israel, because in there we see in Daniel, we see 3 good examples that we'd be looking at and learning from those and using those as the basis for us to make decisions like that. So once we've done that, we're going to do a little bit of discussion, and I'll bring up some situations for you to think about and discuss how you would handle it or how the church should handle it, and we'll look at it from that perspective too. Okay, so I have a friend in Canada, and this happened like a month ago. He's not a Christian. He has what we now call comorbidities. You may have heard that phrase. It means the person has other medical problems that make COVID a greater risk to them. And so Linda was one of those people. And Linda didn't take the shot because her doctor advised her that it might be dangerous for her to take the shot. And so she had a comorbidity, meaning that she had something else that was endangering her life, and the addition of COVID might push it over the edge. So he has some comorbidities, and he's very afraid of getting COVID. And he's quite certain that if he gets COVID, he will die from it. And so his perspective on it, not being a Christian and having these comorbidities, is that he wants everybody to be forced to mask up and get all their shots. He thinks that that's a completely reasonable thing to do, is that everybody in the whole world should be masked up and taking their shots to protect him. And a bit selfish, but there you are. That's the idea. So, but what's happening in Canada right now is that various churches in Canada, and you saw that one pastor there, are refusing these COVID rules that the government is trying to put on them. And they're saying you don't have an authority to do that. Nonetheless, they have kind of a tyrant in charge right now who's doing that. So what he said, my friend said to me, is he said, talking about these churches that aren't obeying the rules, he says they can't be real Christians, right? Because if they were real Christians, they would do what the government says, because Christians are supposed to do what the government says. And I told him, no, that's not what the Bible says. And it says under normal circumstances we do, but this is not a normal circumstance. And so the question comes down to is, where's that line that we can use to say, the government has stepped over the line, and now we say no. Now it's no, we're not going to do that. You've told us to do something that's not acceptable. And so that's really what we're searching for in this whole lesson is finding those lines and those rules, those guidelines that can help us to make that decision if we get into that situation. So normally the church and the state do not overlap. Normally each one has their own interest area and they don't overlap. And we saw that with Jesus speaking in Matthew 22, 19 through 22. And he says, I'm sure you know this story, but I'll read through it anyway. Show me a denarius of the head tax money, he says. And they brought a denarius to him, and Yeshua said to them, whose is this image and inscription? And they were saying, Caesar's. He said to them, give therefore what is Caesar's to Caesar, and what is God's to God. And when they heard, they were amazed, and they left him and departed, because they understood what he was saying. He was saying that God has an area of interest, which isn't money, and God despises money, but Caesar has another area of interest, which is money. And there's no overlap there. There's no real conflict. He says, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, give to God what's God's. They don't want the same thing. But we know that sometimes, and we're seeing it now in our lives, there are times when the ruling powers think that they should step into the area that is God's. So usually they don't conflict, but we know that there are times when they do. So going to that, the beginning of that passage that Cynthia covered last week, Romans 13, it says, let every soul be subject to the authority of the great, to the authority of the person who's in charge. For there is no authority that is not from the same God, and those authorities who are from God are under orders. So the point there that's made is there is no authority that is not from God, and that means that God raises up governments, all authorities, he brings them into power, and he takes them down as he chooses, and that's entirely his business. He does that according to whatever goals and whatever he's trying to do. And God is always in charge of everything, always. There aren't any exceptions to that. There isn't a government that comes into power without God allowing it or even sometimes bringing it into power. Good morning. Sometimes, though, those authorities are evil, and that even serves God's purpose. God will intentionally bring evil people into authority, and he even says in the Bible that he does do that and has done that, and intentionally to bring in evil people. So continue on with what Romans 13 says. It says, those authorities who are from God are under orders. So all of these authorities that God has placed into positions of authority, they are responsible to God for what they do. Whether a good person or a bad person, they are responsible to God. And so that's true of all authorities that are authorities over us. It's true of the church authorities that God has put into positions, and it's also true of the worldly authorities that God has put into position. So all of these authorities are answerable to God for what they do. And within the church, we understand that. There are other Bible verses that talk about that. It talks about the pastor and the elders are responsible to a higher degree for the things that they teach and they say in the church. And as pastor and teacher, we understand that from the Bible that we have a higher level of responsibility because we are in these positions. So next question would be, why would God raise up an evil authority? Why would he allow that to happen, or why would he even cause that to happen? And the simple answer to that is that evil needs to be allowed to be active and to do evil. In order for people to see evil and understand how evil is and how evil works, evil has to be allowed to happen. But that's not really a satisfying answer. And we can't really answer that because we don't understand God's mind in all of these decisions. But we know that God does raise up these evil governments sometimes, and it is for us to do what we should do when those situations come about. So we don't always understand God's purpose. Sometimes we do. In the Bible, there are examples where God explains why he's doing that. And one of those comes from Habakkuk. In this case, God is saying that he is raising up the Babylonians to beat on Israel, to bring Israel back to him because they've turned away from him. So he has a purpose for bringing evil people into authority, and he does do that. So this is from Habakkuk 1:6. He said, this is God speaking in a prophecy. He says, "For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people who march throughout the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs." So he says, I'm bringing up these evil people. They're fierce, impetuous people. They storm through all the earth, grabbing up the places, the dwelling places that people have, and go on doing that. And he goes on to explain how they're going to tear through Israel. So in this prophecy, there's a person who is responding to that, and he's shocked by that, by what God has just said. He thinks that God is too good to do such a thing, that God would never raise up an evil empire or an evil leader to do that. And he responds by saying, this is from Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 13. He says to God, "Your eyes are too pure to approve evil, and you cannot look on wickedness with favor. Why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously?" So he's kind of baffled by this whole idea that God just told him that he's raising up these evil people to crush Israel. And he says, surely you're too good to do that. Well, the answer is no. God does that intentionally. He raises up evil authorities to do his will sometimes. But those evil authorities are answerable to him. And in Habakkuk, it does explain what's going to happen to the Babylonians as a result of doing this, because they are doing it by their choice. So God says those Babylonians, when they're done doing God's work, they're going to be punished for what they've done, and they will be destroyed. And that's what happened historically. We know that the Babylonians were wiped out completely, and there's no remnant of them. So God does raise up evil people. He takes down evil people and evil countries for his own purposes. And sometimes these evil authorities are just evil to themselves. They do evil things to people, but they don't step on God's turf. But sometimes they do that. They step on the areas that are God's areas, the things that he keeps to himself. And so when they do evil things, maybe they kill people indiscriminately, whatever, that's God's concern. That's not so much our concern. It's an evil thing to do, and we would want to explain to them that, but it doesn't affect us directly. But when they start telling God's people to do evil things, that's a different matter. That becomes our concern, because we are responsible for what we do. And we are expected to be watchful and to live the way that God says. And so we need to always be watching those authorities to see if they're telling us to do things that we shouldn't be doing. And it would be nice if it was always easy to recognize when you're being told to do something evil, because it isn't black and white. It's not nearly that easy. There are some cases that are black and white, but there's a whole lot of gray area in the middle there. And so we know that the devil works in that way. He always works in little steps. And so he will kind of nibble away, trying to get you to compromise and compromise and compromise, and finally get you to do a big thing in little steps. And that's just the way he works all the time, because it's so effective on people. But sometimes it comes also with a justification. You should do this for the benefit of somebody else. You should do that because you are protecting somebody else, or you're doing something good for somebody else. And so what they're trying to get you to do is to do something wrong and explaining to you that it's really you're doing something right. So you always have to watch out for those kind of things that these authorities will try to do to get you to do what's wrong. And so also what usually comes about here is the people in authority know that what they're telling Christians especially to do, Christians aren't going to do. And so it comes with a penalty. And we saw that with the pastor there. Sometimes it just comes with something as guilt, that just try to guilt you into doing it. And so they say, don't you really care about people? Do you only care about yourself? Are you really that stuck on yourself that you can't do something good for other people? But sometimes also it comes with threats of destruction of valuables or even life, imprisonment, all those sorts of things can be part of the danger that comes along. And that danger comes upon us if we make that decision to disregard what the authorities are telling us to do. So now we'll talk a little bit about what our relationship with kings and others in authority should be. And this comes from 1 Peter chapter 2. And it says, And let your way of life be beautiful before all children of men. So what that is saying is live a beautiful life so that everyone can see the beautiful life that you're living. And continue on, it says, those who speak wicked words of you. So even those people who say wicked things about you, live a beautiful life and so that they can see that. And then the verse continues on saying that they may see your beautiful works and praise God in the day of examination. So on Judgment Day, it's saying these people will have no recourse to say anything bad about you because they know that you've been doing good things all the time. They said wicked things about you. So that should be how we live our lives normally. And then it continues on and says, submit to all the sons of men for the sake of God, to kings because of their authority, and judges because they are sent by him for the punishment of wrongdoers and for the praise of the workers of good. Now that's very similar to what we saw in Romans 13. For it is the will of God in this way, that by your excellent works you may shut the mouths of fools, those who do not know God, as free children and not as persons who make their liberty a cloak for their evil, but as servants of God. Honor every person, love your brethren, worship God, and honor kings. So it says what our view on everybody should be. We should honor everyone in their role as an ordinary person. We should love the brethren in the church. We should worship God, and we should honor kings in the way that kings should be honored. And that doesn't always mean obeying them. It means giving them the honor that's appropriate to a king. Yeah, we'll talk about the Hebrew boys in Babylon and some others and how they continued to honor the kings that they had, even though the kings had told them to do things that were wrong. So you probably remember these stories from Daniel. They're very well-known stories. And the first one comes after the Babylonian captivity. Right after that, very few people were taken to Babylon. Just a remnant of Israel were taken there. And among them were a lot of young men, and these young men were brought into the service of the king. And you remember that they were offered food that wasn't kosher. They were pretty sure that it wasn't cooked and wasn't done the way it was supposed to be done according to the Bible. And so they said, we can't eat this food. Please let us eat vegetables only. And they eat vegetables only because vegetables are always kosher. There's never a problem with a carrot. You can't have an unkosher carrot or an impure carrot. So that's what they would do because they didn't know what was being offered to them for food. And we know how that story comes out. In the end, they do better than all the other boys who are drinking the wine and foods and all the sorts of luxuries that the palace had to offer. And so they rejected that because they knew that that was something that God had specifically said, don't do that. Don't eat foods that are pork and other things are not prepared properly. So that was one incident from the Babylonian captivity. There's two more that we're going to cover, and then I'll kind of summarize the messages to learn from that. So King Nebuchadnezzar was the person who conquered Israel, and he set up a statue and demanded that everybody in his kingdom would worship this golden statue that he created. He was not a good man. He, as God said, he's a man who goes and tears through other countries and slaughters the people and takes all their property. And God himself said that was an evil man. So he was an evil man. And the Hebrew captives didn't say to him, you're so evil, we're not going to do anything you say. They honored him, as that verse that we just read said. They gave him the honor that is due to a king. But that doesn't mean that they always obeyed him. So when he said that everyone must worship his idol, they weren't going to do that. They knew that that was wrong. That's first commandment. Easy to get that one. And so they said they wouldn't do that. And what you see there is first there's an effort to pressure them into doing that, to go along, get along. And we'll always see that in our lives. There's always people who are going to try to convince us to do something wrong and to just take the easy path. And it's always the easy path to go ahead and do wrong. The right path is always the one that's the hard path. So they pressured him and tried to get these boys to do this, to bow down and worship this idol, but they said that they wouldn't do that. And so they were forced to stand out, and they stood up, and everyone else around them was bowing and could see that they were standing up and not bowing like they were supposed to be bowing. So they were forced to kind of stand out and be noticed for what they were doing. And then after that, when the king saw that they weren't bowing, he called them in and specifically threatened their life. He said, if you don't do this, I'm going to throw you into the fiery furnace and you're done. And they said, you have no control over us. If you throw us in the fire and we're gone, we still aren't going to do what you're going to do, and we're not going to do it if we live. So you really don't have any control over us. And he said, here's your last chance. Bow down or you're done. And you know how that story came out. So, but through all of this thing, you see them saying, "O King," and "O mighty King," and things like that. And they don't despise him for what he's doing. Their attitude towards him is one of respect, as it should be, but nonetheless, they're disobeying what he wants them to do because it's wrong. And so, ask yourself this: could they have bowed down and worshiped God instead? So could they have found some kind of middle ground there to fake it out and get along and make it look like they were getting along and doing the thing, but they're in fact worshiping God instead of the statue? And the answer is no. That destroys your credibility. It destroys your message, your ability to tell other people what's right and wrong. If you look like you're a compromiser like that, people aren't going to accept anything you say. And so how you look to people in your life is your important message. That it's about what you are and what God is in you. And so you can't make those kind of compromises that make it look like you're doing something. These people are going to see what you're doing and discount your credibility because of it. So they couldn't have done that. That compromise route would have been the wrong route. But again, it's the easy thing to do. So the third example from the Babylonian captivity of Israel is Daniel in the lion's den. In this case, it was King Darius. The Medes and Persians had conquered over the Babylonians by that time and wiped out the Babylonians. So this king is tricked into creating a law that's going to hurt Daniel. There are people who are trying to get Daniel out of his place of authority, and they're trying to find a way to do that. And they tricked the king into making this law that is impossible for Daniel to obey. And so King Darius, this is from Daniel chapter 6, verse 7, "Anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides the king for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den." Now, some important questions here are, has God commanded us to pray to him at least once a month? No, there's no commandment like that. Or has God commanded us to pray facing the east with open windows? Because that's what Daniel was doing. He would pray out that window facing east, which was sort of Jerusalem. And so he would do that. That was his practice. Well, there's no commandment to do that either. And so you would think, well, couldn't Daniel have just stopped praying for 30 days? That wouldn't have been a violation of anything. Or could he just have closed his windows so nobody could see what he was doing? But this really comes down to his worship time is God's turf, his area. It's a time between him and God. And these are his practices. And so he doesn't change anything. When he finds out about this law being signed into action, he goes home and immediately goes up and prays just as he had before. He doesn't change anything. And that's a message there for us, is that we need to understand that our worship time is a special time between us and God, and nobody else belongs in that area. And so nobody else should be telling us what to do. And so the three messages that we can draw from those events in the Babylonian exile are: we are responsible for what gets into us, and no one can force us to do anything. We have a right to say no to that. And in their case, it was unclean foods, but there's more to it than that. Whether it's something you see, whether it's something you hear, or something that comes into your mouth, we are to be the temple of the Lord. We are to be that place set aside for God. And we need to be prepared to say, no, this I believe is going to be a danger to me. So I was mentioning before that there are people who have comorbidities. And so these governments like to give out one law. And the law is everybody has to have these shots. But that's not the right law for everybody. There are people who have special circumstances, and laws like that don't make room for that. And so there are cases where that would be an endangerment to yourself. And so you need to be, you are in authority over your temple, your body, and you need to run that as it is the temple of the Lord. And so this is also a message from Adam and Eve, if you remember that time. We covered that in a lesson quite some time ago. Adam's failure is not that he intentionally did something wrong. His failure is that he allowed things to happen that he just wasn't watching for. And so he allowed Eve to give him food that he shouldn't have been eating. And he ate it without asking, what is this, or checking to make sure that it wasn't what the fruit that they were not supposed to be eating. And so he just wasn't being careful. He wasn't watching all the time. And we know that we need to be watchful. Satan is always trying to find little ways to trick us to do things. So So the message from the first part of the Babylonian exile is that we are responsible for what gets into us, and we need to control that as much as we can. The second lesson from that is that we are to obey God's laws, and that these come first. All of these things are greater than the authorities. So if the authorities tell us to do something that definitely breaks God's laws, then we say, nope, that's not acceptable. And the third point from the Babylonian captivity is that we need to keep our worship space clean. The Old Testament talks about that in a lot of different ways, about things you shouldn't do and things you shouldn't bring into the worship space, all of that. And so we need to keep our own personal worship space clean of influences, and that includes people telling us how to worship. How we worship is really between us and God, and we don't want to be giving others control over that. And so that kind of deals mostly with that pastor that we saw, is that the Canadian government was telling him what hours his church could work or whether they couldn't work and how they had to do a bunch of things. And he said, no, this is a worship space. This is not yours to control. And he's right about that. So there are three things there. We are in charge of our bodies and what comes into our bodies. We have a worship space with God, or we should, and that is, no one has any authority over that. And the third one is obeying the laws of God always. So we'll make another point here and then move on a little bit. So we see this idea of that there are times when authorities need to be ignored. And this example here comes with Paul. He's brought into a council along with some other apostles, and because they've been teaching about Jesus, and this council had told them not to do that. So from Acts 5:27 through 29, it says, "And when they brought them, they stood them before the whole council, and the high priest began to say to them, 'Have we not emphatically commanded you that you teach no one in this name, in the name of Jesus? But behold, you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you wish to bring the blood of this man upon us.' Simeon, Simon Peter, answered with the apostles and said to them, 'God ought to be obeyed more than men.'" And that's always the case. What God has told us to do overrules what any authorities might tell us to do. And in this case, what's happened is the authorities are this council and the high priests, and they did have authority. They had God-given authority to do a lot of different things, even going so far as penalties, beatings, stonings, things like that. And so they were in authority, and normally they would be obeyed. But in this case, God has said, go out and teach the message that I've given you, bring the message of salvation to everyone. And that's what they were doing. And they're saying to this council, God has told us to do this, and that's what we're going to do. And what you're saying is not going to change anything. So that's their reason for disobeying the authorities. The authorities are trying to get them to do something different from what they've been told to do by Jesus. And so again, we see this opportunity for a compromise. Was there some way to find a compromise with these authorities? You could work out some sort of deal with them so that you would only teach it a certain way or do something like that, some kind of a compromise. And those situations are always there. We need to be careful that we don't compromise away the things that we shouldn't be. And sometimes you can find good compromises, but in many cases, when people are trying to get us to do things that God doesn't want us to do, there isn't a good compromise. And that was the case here. There just wasn't anything that they could do. They had to give this message, and the council didn't want them to give the message. So I mentioned this before, but I'll say it again. When you come to that point where you have to say no to authority, you can expect that there's going to be consequences for that. And man up. And so for this Canadian pastor, his situation was that on his fifth arrest, because he's been ignoring them and they've been fining him, and he ignores them, and his church gives all the money to pay the fine, and he continues on, and they've been doing that for some period of time. And so the authorities haven't been able to get him to change anything. And there are other pastors too. He's not the only one doing that. So the government claims that his crime is that he was at a speech, or at a meeting, and he gave a speech, and this is a peaceful protest, but he said, the government says that he aided and abetted mischief and interfered with critical infrastructure. So that was his crime of teaching people about what God says about things like COVID and things like that, and who has authority over the church. And so they called that abetting mischief and interfering with critical infrastructure, because they see it differently. So because he had done this so many times, in that picture that you saw, that was his fifth arrest. The judge decided that he wasn't going to get any bail anymore. So essentially, he's being found guilty of future crimes. They're saying that you're such a threat because you haven't obeyed the law before. We expect you're going to break the law again, and so we don't want you to do that. So we're not going to allow you to have any bail, and you're going to be locked in prison. You're going to stay there. And nonetheless, he continues to do what he believes is right. And so that's a consequence. And we've seen that in the Bible too. How many times did the apostles get injured, attempted to be stoned, thrown in jail, those sorts of things? And when authorities tell you to do things that are wrong, you have to do what's right. But nonetheless, consequences come. And there's an interesting Japanese saying that says, the nail that sticks up gets pounded down. And that's the idea here. Esther?
Actually, I watched the pastor.
Oh, yeah?
I watched several videos of him, and it was very depressing. See how the authorities, they take him like a criminal.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so thankful my niece is here. She's actually, her husband is from Canada, and they just moved
Oh,
to
okay.
the States, back to the States, because I was like, I told my sister, I'm so grateful Rachel's here, because there's a lot of persecution there.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. I was watching how they were treating him like a criminal. I also watched several videos, and I was like, how can they do that? He's just preaching the gospel. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, can't believe that. It's just...
Yeah, it's amazing. And I left Canada 25 years ago because it was starting to turn, and I could see that the changes were starting to happen. And now it's gotten quite a bit worse. And those government authorities believe that they have the authority to do that, and so they do it. But for us, we have to say, what does God want of us?
So do you think those truckers, that are blocking all the highway and all that, you think that's connected in some way with that protest, directly or indirectly?
Maybe a more recent Canadian export would have a better answer on that one.
I've been here about 3 years. We left just before the COVID stuff started happening, so I'm not really sure other than what they put on the...
I think it's more the product of general frustration with government authority, telling the people what to do.
It seems like they started that blockage, right? And it seems like in America we started, following up on that.
Yeah. Normally Canada doesn't get into the American news at all.
This morning I saw a news that they're starting to do that here in Texas.
Yeah, they're starting a thing. The one in the country here, that's the trucker thing that's starting here, was caused by the one in Canada. The cause for the one in Canada was, I think, just people being frustrated with all these government regulations, limiting them. And I don't want to go too far off topic here, but really, whenever you have a tyrannical power like that, a power who gives out this one law that everyone must follow, you just know that there are going to be people who can't follow it for some reason or another. And that's just the way it works. And so whenever you centralize power and authority like that, you get rules that just can't apply to everybody because they don't make sense for everybody.
Well, the other problem we're having here is the administration has shut down the oil pumps and such,
Mm-hmm.
And the consequences, we're importing the oil, even though we already have it here, and we're paying so much more, and that affects the trucking industry,
Mm-hmm.
and that affects the food, it affects everything else.
Yeah.
So I think that's really an example of how a government can be very tyrannical too.
Yeah, and I'll make a point here that's probably obvious, but I'll say it anyway. As citizens of a country, we are allowed to do everything that other citizens are allowed to do. So if we do what's called a peaceful protest, which is allowed in the country, then that's fine for us to do. But if we step over that line and start getting into violence or anything like that, that's not God's way. We need to be careful that we don't make that step in a wrong direction. So things like these trucker protests, if they're legal and everything is good, that's fine to be involved in them. But sometimes protests like that can turn very violent and anti-God, and we need to be careful not to be seen to be involved in them. Okay, didn't want to spend any real time there. We'll get back to similar topics to that. So, and so kind of the message here, or the question here is, when is it that Romans 13 doesn't apply anymore? When is it that we have to say no to authorities? Now, we've looked at Daniel, and those are really good examples of general principles for us. And And so Romans 13, 1 and 2, I'll just do a quick reminder here. It says, let every soul be subject to the authority of the great. Whoever therefore stands against the authority stands against the decrees of God, and these who stand against them shall receive judgment. So Peter here doesn't mention, as I said before, any exception. He just sort of says you have to follow the authority, but we know that there are exceptions from other places. We saw the apostles talking to those people in that court and saying, no, God comes first, we're going to obey God. And we need to understand that so much is that because when government does start to encroach on God's areas, we need to start to watch for that and say, this is the line and I can't cross this line anymore. So I'll bring up some scenarios here and we'll talk about them. This one is an old one, and because I'm an old guy, I was alive at the time. And there's some other old people here too who probably remember. But back when I was a kid, back when I was a kid, there was this thing called the USSR, which is not what it once was. And they went through a lot of periods when they really persecuted Christians. And by persecution, I mean torture, sometimes execution, frequently execution. And they would get into that very seriously for periods of time and then back off for a while. And so even though the official policy in the USSR that religions were protected, they would just do it anyway. And the authorities would send out their forces to persecute people and to kill them, in fact. And so in one case that I remember from my youth, the police found people worshiping in some building, some house or something, and decided that they were going to make an example. And they required each person to leave the building. And as they did, they had to step on a Bible. And if they didn't step on the Bible, they would be shot. So in that scenario, what would you do?
Get shot.
Okay, what's the basis for a decision to not step on the Bible? See, the Bible is just a book, right? It's just paper and ink. But what's in well, it's God's word in paper and ink, but God's word is not the paper or not the ink. Yes, yeah. Yeah, so what they're really trying to do here is trying to get these people to make some kind of a commitment that they're rejecting the faith, and then to make it look like by stepping on the Bible they're rejecting the faith. And so that really takes us back to what we saw with the Daniel case, is that they were trying to get people to do things to worship. And so even if you had faked worshiping this golden idol, you would still have destroyed your credibility because people would see what you've done. And in the case of these people from Russia, or the USSR, which was bigger than Russia, these people, if they had not or had stepped on the Bible, that would have damaged their credibility. People would have trouble believing that they were serious about the faith. Yes.
It's just like nowadays, I see people don't carry the Bibles anymore. They just carry their phones.
Yeah, well, it's different now. I'm not stepping on my phone for anybody. I have a whole bunch of important information on my phone. I don't want to lose it. And so it's different now, yeah, because your Bible is just one of many things on a phone. But yeah, back in those days, there was no such thing as cell phones. There was only printed Bibles. Okay, so the principle here is that you can't be forced to apostatize, but apostatize means turning away from the faith. And so these guys were trying to get people to make that decision about whether they were really in love with God or whether they were not so hot for God. And so the stepping on the Bible is going to be a symbol of that. But that doesn't cause you to become an unbeliever, that stepping on a Bible. And no one can force you to apostatize, to turn away from God. That's a decision you have to make yourself. But appearances matter, and they matter to your ability to spread the gospel message.
Well, did they get shot?
Yes.
They were all shot?
I don't remember the whole story. I think it went along that they shot enough people that they got tired of shooting people. Even military soldiers are people, and killing a person for stepping on a book or not stepping on a book is a hard thing to choke down.
And far enough for the weapon cause a recoil of their hands, leaving it pretty much damaging their hands. You know, forget about those guns away.
Yeah, well, yeah, the whole thing would wear down on them, and that's really truly what happened in the USSR many times. They would start persecuting and killing people, and the other people in society would see this going on, and they would say, hey, we don't want this in our society, and they would get the authorities to stop doing it. And so they would stop doing it for a few years and then start doing it again, slowly bring in more persecution. So it went back and forth in the USSR many times that way. And my recollection, it could be wrong, it was a long time ago, was that they shot some number of people and then they got bored of doing it and stopped.
Maybe run out of bullets.
Yeah.
So about that story, thank you for sharing that with us. And like you were saying, it's really psychological, but then you go back to the scripture and it tells you, God's telling you, I did not give you a spirit of fear, because that's what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so even though some people might say, well, if you don't step on it, oh, it's okay, you know, it's just, no, I think, in my humble opinion, I think God will judge that, because he told you, do not live in fear.
Mm-hmm.
And so by you not stepping on it because you're afraid to get killed, or whatever, we're all gonna die. And so by you not stepping on the Bible, or stepping on the Bible, I should say, by you stepping on the Bible and allowing it to control you, you are living in fear.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You're not living the gospel. You're not going out. You may be preaching it, but you're not living it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in doing that, you damage your credibility.
Well, see, the objective is to force people to comply by killing someone, and then everybody else gets scared and they fall into line. But it can also backfire,
Mm-hmm.
because if you kill them, then some people will be so appalled or so angry, and maybe they'll rebel or something. So it could backfire on them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it can go either way.
Yeah, definitely true. Yeah, and we also need to remember. In fact, I wrote it down here. There are people watching what you do, and so in this situation, there are people who are needing courage and needing strength, and your example will give them what they need to make that decision. And so here are these people being forced to walk out. Who knows who went first, but whoever went first was able to make that decision and say, I'm not going to step on the Bible. I'm going to go out and I'm going to be shot, and that's fine. And all the people who are cowering in the back of the church can see that and say, he did it. I guess I can do it too. So we give strength to other people by the things that we do. And I talked about that one already. Okay, in a more recent time, this happened something like, I want to say 6 years ago or 7 years ago. The city of Houston introduced a bill, and this bill was going to require all pastors in the city of Houston to submit their sermons to the city in advance for approval.
What?
Yeah, I know. You'd say, what? But that happened. And it was all over the news in San Antonio as well. When they brought in this bill in, and it was going through the bill process. There's a whole bunch of passage things that have to happen first. And as soon as it was introduced, everybody lit up. And so obviously you would say, yeah, they're stepping outside of their authority. We're not going to do that. They have no authority to dictate what gets preached from the pulpit, even though they think they do. But that goes back to what we were saying before. The worship space is God's space, and they have no authority to step inside of there and tell us how we should worship or what we should do. And that's what they were trying to do here. So that's the basis for this one, is that we have a worship space that is ours between us and God, and no one has authority to intervene in that, to tell us what should be preached, anything like that. And so think about it this way. If someone is there who has to approve your message, is it still your message, even though he just looked at your thing and said, okay, that's good, give the stamp and fine? No, because he's got authority over it now, because he's exercised authority, even though he hasn't done anything to change it or anything you've said in it. The fact that he is in that position of approving your message is the problem. It's no longer your message, it's his message, and he's just approved it. Okay, what happened in that story is that all of the churches, of course, complained about that and rose up, and there was a huge row about that. And in the end, the bill never came for a vote. They gave up on it and didn't move it forward. But just the fact that it was introduced was interesting at that time, because in the U.S., no one had ever done that. I'm sure it would have been found unconstitutional if it had gotten into place. because they're plainly stepping over boundaries that are constitutional. But nonetheless, there was such a complaint about that. But so even here in Texas, even in Houston, we can see that there are people in authorities who would like to trample on the churches and tell the churches what to do. And more these sacred cows of homosexuality and cross-dressing and all of that sort of stuff, those are things that are going to be the front line of stuff. And marriage, homosexual marriage, all that sort of stuff is kind of the advancing edge that we see coming towards us and towards the church. And the governments are going to, and talking about, forcing the churches to do things that just simply aren't biblical. I mentioned that before too. Okay, required masking, which is a topic for our immediate time. I'll bring out these three first of all. For a while there, we were required to wear masks inside of stores, even when we were outside and in our own home. Well, maybe that wasn't in Texas, maybe that was other places. But in any case, how does masking come into this in those different scenarios? If the government tells us to mask up and get our shots, what do you think about that one? Should we obey? Should we disobey?
Well, I chose to obey because I have other health issues that I'm concerned about, but I also respect people who disobey, because they have their own reasons for that. And pretty much the same philosophy I have, where being a non-combatant, it was my personal choice. I didn't want to carry a weapon in the military. However, I defend the Second Amendment of anybody who wants to carry a weapon. So if I did anything other than that, I would be the same as an evil government, because I would say everybody's going to do what I do. So that's not correct either.
Yeah.
In my job, we're required to wear the mask. So, and for a time when people that were getting the shot, they said they removed it, but I was sick. I didn't get that privilege myself. So anyway, but talking about obeying, I felt threatened myself. When I said, I'm not going to get the shot because it's my conviction not to get it, and my belief, the way I believe, so then I felt like, if they're going to take the job from me, they take it, I'm going to just pursue guards, will open the doors, and I'll, he'll get me another job. Even might not be, this is not the best job, but I have stayed with it because it's the best I can get with some benefits. But I said, God will open the doors, but it was just like, I like my job, even though it's keep me busy and I'm stressed and everything. I enjoy the work environment, being there, but it is nowadays there's nothing secure. So if I had to go to another direction, I guess I gotta go.
Yeah, and something to recognize here is that this is a gray area. And definitely, there are people who will choose one way within a church. There are people who choose one way, and people who choose another way. And some of them do it for biblical reasons. They're saying, I'm in control of my body. I believe this is an endangerment to my body, and I don't want it. And that is your authority. But another person in the same church, sitting beside you in the same church, could make a different decision there. So you can have a situation where people in the church itself disagree about matters like this. And so we need to understand the basic principles that we got from Daniel about what we are required to have authority over, our bodies, our worship space, and obeying the law. And we need to look at those and ask ourselves against those biblical bases, whether we should be doing the things that the governments are telling us to do. And like I said, there's a gray area here, and people will make different choices. And in the church, we shouldn't criticize them for their choice.
No, my coworker, I found 2 or 3 people they think like the way I believe, and then we felt, like anyone's threatened, they're gonna take the job, and we don't want to lose it.
Yeah.
But then I was like, one of my coworkers, she just felt terrible, and she was so stressed out. I'm working as much overtime. I believe I should not take the shot, and she was having an emotional conflict. And then she goes, the next time she came and she goes, I don't want to lose the job. She said, I got the shot. I said, well, it's your own choice. I said, I'm not gonna say anything, it's your own choice, it's personal choice, whatever they want. But she said, I'm not getting the other one. She said, I'm not getting the other one. I said, well, it's what you want, but my other body, and she talked, have you got the shot? I said, no, I haven't. I said, oh, well, I said, we might be losing the job, But, I request a prayer for everybody. I said, well, they take it. I said, I'll go find another one. It's not the first time I'm looking for a job anyway. So then, my buddy was there, and then we were talking, and I said, no, they're not gonna take it. I go, we'll sue them. I said, well, no, it's too expensive.
Yeah.
But I said, we'll sue them. We kind of lift each other, courage. And then last time we knew, they came out the news. They said, we haven't resolved your section because it was thrown off, so we cannot do anything about it. So it's a great relief.
And as Cynthia was saying, we shouldn't make that decision based on fear. We shouldn't make any decision based on fear. We should make it based on, this is what I believe is the right thing to do, and asking God, take care of me, set my steps, plan everything for me. I trust you to do that. And that's a difficult decision. It's hard to do that. Okay, required vaccination is very similar there. I was kind of wondering if it might be too similar, and we've kind of covered vaccination, so maybe we'll just move on from that. So summarizing what we've looked at here, these key principles here, when we're trying to make that decision about should I do what the government is telling me to do, or is this crossing over the line? And so we need to understand that we are responsible for ourselves. It is for us to make sure that we follow God. And sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's hard, sometimes the choices are black and white, sometimes they're really gray. But no matter who has authority over us, or how they came to that position of authority, or what party they belong to, or what color they are, or anything, none of those things matter to us. What only matters to us is what does God want of me, and how am I supposed to live? And so we are responsible for obeying God's commandments. That's prime. And those are the kind of obvious ones, like we saw in Daniel, being asked to bow down and worship another idol. That's simply not, there's no acceptance for that in the Bible. And so that was an easy decision, but many times those decisions aren't that easy. We need to keep our worship space free of pollution. That means people trying to tell us how to worship or what to worship. And that's, again, that's one that really leads to gray areas about that. Because, for example, what if someone said, actually, we're going to get to this later, I think. Well, we will when we will. But people can tell you to do things that are really iffy there that you might say are maybe acceptable or maybe not. And so we need to keep our temple, our body temple, free from pollution as well. So it's sometimes a difficult decision. It's not always black and white, and sometimes it's very hard to understand. But if you understand the basic biblical principles, you'll be able to make the right decisions. Any more questions or thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to make a comment that I think I read the Bible that we're going to be going through those hard times, so we kind of need to be ready because we might end up suffering some persecution. So we have to kind of be solid on God's word, because right now we're just going through something is nothing, basically, like I said, if I lose a job, well, there's more other jobs, even though they were trying to do it a nationwide, everybody against the president had the idea to everybody get the shot. Everybody. There was not going to be an exception. But anyway, I think there's more stuff that we need to really, we might end up with the apostles, that either you do this or you die. And so how are we going to be ready for that time? If right now, like me, I panic like my job, but the job is not like my life. Yeah,
we do need to be prepared. And I have every reason to believe things are going to get worse. That's what all the trends look like. God can step in and fix things if that's his will. But if things go the way they are, it doesn't look like it's going to get better or easier. It's going to get worse and harder.